Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the land of 10,000 lakes, Minnesota. Minnesota is a state of much medical expertise and innovation. The town of Rochester, Minnesota is home to the famous Mayo Clinic. It's also where the very first open heart surgery and the first bone marrow transplant were performed. And for those geography nerds out there, and I know you're out there, Minnesota is the northernmost of the 48 contiguous states, due completely to the existence of the northwest angle. The northwest angle is that tip that juts out right from the top of Minnesota, and it's bordered by Canada to the west and the north, and by the Lake of the Woods to the east and south. And its very existence as a part of the United States at all is due to a misunderstanding of the geography of the region when they were drawing up borders between American-controlled and British-controlled territories. Moving right along, Minnesota has 8 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 5 Democrats to 3 Republicans. This is the same balance of power that Minnesota had prior to the 2018 midterms, but there were 4 seats that flipped 2 years ago. 4. Half of the seats flipped, but 2 from Republican to Democrat, and the other 2 from Democrat to Republican, for a net change of 0 for either party. It's Minnesota's second and third that flipped from Republican to Democrat 2 years ago, and those are very suburban districts surrounding the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. And Minnesota's first and 8th districts were the ones that flipped from Democrat to Republican, and those are much more rural districts. One covers the southern part of the state, and the other sort of the northeastern part of the state. These 4 changes from 2 years ago are actually a great way to illustrate the sort of urban-rural divide that's occurring in this country from a political point of view, as we see more urban-suburban areas becoming more Democrat and the more rural areas breaking more for Republicans. It is no more apparent anywhere else in the country than Minnesota. We are going to speculate how all 4 of these are going to go this November, and also I'm going to be looking at Minnesota's 7th district, which covers much of the western part of the state, as well as that northwest angle, and it has a Cook Political Report Partisan Voting Index of 12 into the Republican column when compared to the national average, but is represented by, I believe, 15-term Congressman Colin Peterson, a Democrat. So naturally, a Democrat in a district that is plus 12 into the Republican column, we are going to be examining a little further in this series. So let's pull up a line graph now to see how Minnesotans have been voting for the representatives over the last decade. So here we're looking at some pretty curious results. Very competitive at the state level. In those midterm years, 2010 and 2014, had very close results between Democrats and Republicans. There was a more decisive victory at the House level for Democrats in 2012, due in large part probably to incumbent Democratic President Barack Obama being at the top of the ballot that year. And then curiously, in 2016, it sort of was at midterm levels in terms of competitiveness. There was high turnout from both parties, but much closer results during the year that Donald Trump won the presidency over Hillary Clinton. And then going even further into the future, we see Republicans sort of returning to midterm levels, but Democrats maintaining pretty much nearly identical levels in 2018 that they had in 2016. So curiously enough, the separation in a midterm year, 2018, was more stark than in a presidential year, that being 2016, which had not been the case at any other point earlier in the decade. So that alludes to some strength of the Democratic Party in Minnesota, as many more Minnesotans clearly were more motivated to turn out in pretty high numbers 2 years ago. And I'm sure it was largely in those 2 suburban districts that flipped to Democrats, that's 2nd and 3rd, 2 districts that will be very difficult going into this November for Republicans to reclaim. Okay, let's toss that graph aside. Because there's 5 districts in the state that we're speculating about, we're going to be employing Pollbot to help us keep this organized. First, I'm going to list all the districts up here, and next to them is their Cook Political Report Partisan Voting Index score compared to the national average, so you can very clearly see what we're talking about. And we're just going to take this one at a time, going in numerical order, starting with that first district, which covers the southern part of Minnesota, currently controlled by a Republican Pollbot. How is that going to go this November? Okay, and we've already seen our first flip in Minnesota's 1st district, going back to Democratic control after 2 years of being represented by a Republican. This is likely due to the stark increase in expected Democratic turnout at the House level coupled with the return to normality that we saw from Republicans 2 years ago. That just ends up with us anticipating a pretty stellar Democratic turnout in the state this year, and why we think that the 1st District is going to flip back to Democratic control this year. Okay, and up next we do have a more suburban district, Minnesota's 2nd District, currently controlled by a Democrat and has been for the last 2 years. Paulbot, how does that go? Okay, and a suburban district in Minnesota remaining in Democratic hands. That's not a huge surprise. We've seen a pretty obvious suburban backlash against the Republican Party in recent times. It's also probably going to be a pretty similar case for Minnesota's 3rd, which is also one that flipped 2 years ago to Democratic control and is maybe less slightly competitive this year. But Paulbot, how is Minnesota's 3rd likely to go this November? Okay, and again, another Democrat maintaining control of their suburban district this November in Minnesota. Okay, up next, we do have Minnesota's 7th District, which is also controlled by a Democrat, Colin Peterson, 15-term congressman. I believe he's been in Congress since 1991, and his district is pretty clearly trending Republican lately. It has a Cook Political Report partisan score of plus 12 into the Republican column, when compared to the national average, as I've already said. And he's been holding on to his seat by closer and closer margins in more recent election years. I believe the last one was about 4 to 5% in his favor. Paulbot, how is that likely to go for Peterson this year? Okay, wow. Yeah, and that speaks strongly of his incumbency factor, I believe, in a district that is so clearly trending Republican. We are projecting Colin Peterson holding on to his seat probably pretty narrowly this year, I believe. I'm guessing about a 3 to 4% margin of victory for Colin Peterson this November. And lastly, we have that 8th District, which flipped from Democrat to Republican 2 years ago and has a Cook score of plus 4 into the Republican column when compared to the national average. Paulbot, how's that going to go? Okay, wow, and we do have another flip, actually, before the day is out, in Minnesota's 8th District. We are projecting that it is going to go back into Democrats' hands this November. A district with a score of just plus 4 into the Republican column in a year where turnout is likely to be pretty high among Minnesota Democrats. Leads me to believe that it is narrowly going to go back into the Democrats' hands this year. I mean, as we saw from the line graph already, over the last 2 years, it's been trending pretty favorably in Democrats' favor. And so by my count, we are seeing a net gain of plus 2 for Democrats in the state at the House level in Minnesota. It's actually the 2 districts that flipped to Republican control 2 years ago that are going back into Democrats' hands this year. And Democrats are also maintaining their holds on those 2 suburban districts that they flipped, as well as Minnesota's 7th District. Let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a Senate election in Minnesota. Democratic incumbent Tina Smith is running for her first full term as Minnesota's junior senator. She was previously appointed to finish the term of former Senator Al Franken's term when he resigned amid scandal. And Tina Smith won a special election in 2018 to actually finish out those last 2 years. So already 2 years later, she's running to hold on to her seat for a second time, this time for a full 6 years. She is running against Republican challenger Jason Lewis, seen here, who was the former representative for Minnesota's 2nd District before he lost his re-election in 2018. So he's already known somewhat politically in the state, especially in that district, a suburban district. To see how Minnesotans have been voting for senators, let's pull up some voter turnout ratios right now. And looking here, we're seeing some numbers that are good. They're very good, actually, for Democrats. Pretty poor for Republicans. Senatorial Republican candidates in the state. Republicans never getting above 100%, and Democrats never falling below 100% going over the last 10 years or the last 3 senatorial election cycles. And interestingly enough, the Democrats' best showing here occurred in a presidential year, and that's also the time that Republicans had their worst showing in terms of these voter ratios. All we can do is take these 3 values for each party and make a projection into this November, which is exactly what we're going to do. Let's toss those numbers aside and lastly consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case Senator Tina Smith. She is currently sitting at a plus 13-point approval rating in the state, which is pretty decent. Certainly going to play into her favor this year with projected turnout for House Democrats, coupled with their advantage in those voter turnout ratios. Let's take all those values, Paulbot, and to calculate how this is going to go for these 2 in November. And there you have it, Tina Smith winning her first full term against challenger Jason Lewis by a 19.58% margin of the vote. Smith just has everything working in her favor this year, honestly. I mean, she's above water in terms of her approval rating, and Democrats have just historically turned out in greater numbers for both senatorial candidates and House candidates in the past, and I have every reason to believe that that will continue into this year. So let's make this official and put it on our senatorial map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Minnesota actually has the longest active streak in voting for Democratic presidential candidates, and it goes all the way back to 1972. The state did vote for Richard Nixon over George McGovern that year, but that is the last time Minnesota has voted for a Republican candidate for president. It was the only state to vote for Walter Mondale in 1984 over Ronald Reagan. Walter Mondale was a native of Minnesota. So at the end of that election, Mondale walked away with 10 Electoral College votes from Minnesota plus the 3 from Washington, D.C. for a grand total of 13. More recently, Minnesota broke for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump by a very, very narrow 1.5% margin of victory, effectively putting the state in Republicans' crosshairs this year. To learn more about how Minnesotans vote for their presidential candidates, let's pull up some more voter turnout ratios right now. And looking at these, interestingly enough, the Republicans actually are holding the advantage in these percentage values, very much unlike what we saw for senatorial candidates. And in fact, what's extra strange is the difference is more stark in 2012 than it was for 2016, even though Donald Trump got really, really close to carrying the state 4 years ago. The reason Obama carried the state more definitively than Clinton, despite what we're seeing from these voter ratios, is because these are based on the raw turnout numbers that voters give to House candidates in Minnesota. And of course, the difference was much more heavily in Democrats' favor in 2012 than it was in 2016, as we saw previously. So despite Donald Trump having an advantage of nearly 4% in this category, it still wasn't quite enough to make up for the deficit in voters for Republicans at the House level. Also interesting to note that values for both parties decreased going from 2012 to 2016. That's just mainly speaking to lagging enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in the state 4 years ago. I do expect values to be slightly higher for both parties going into this year, so let's keep that in the back of our minds and toss those numbers aside. Lastly, we do have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case, President Trump. As of this video, he is at negative 17 points in the state. He has the approval of 40% of Minnesotans and the disapproval of 57%. So that's certainly going to be working against him, in spite of the fact that he may have a slight advantage in voter turnout ratios based on what we've seen. So now let's take everything we know and give it to Pollbot to calculate how this is going to go for Joe Biden and Donald Trump in Minnesota. Pollbot. And there's your answer. It has Joe Biden carrying the land of 10,000 lakes by about a 6.6% margin of victory over Donald Trump this year. Republicans remain very hopeful about carrying Minnesota this year. Barack Obama carried the state by just over 7%, I believe, in 2012. That narrowed to just 1.5% for Hillary Clinton 4 years later, so they're hoping that trajectory will continue to work in their favor, but largely due in part to suburban backlash in Democrats' favor, plus Donald Trump's pretty poor approval rating in Minnesota. We do have Joe Biden projected to return to almost 2012 levels. He's not quite reaching Barack Obama levels, but he's getting close. So that's another 10 Electoral College votes that we've projected for Joe Biden this year. Let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So all the election results are in for the state of Minnesota. It's all pretty good news for Democrats from what we've projected, but make no mistake, Minnesota is going to be a nail-biter this year. Let's talk briefly about the future of the state by pulling up an old line graph and two new ones to see project where it might be heading. So first, let's take a closer look at the raw House turnout graph that we were looking at earlier in the video. Specifically, look at those slope values that you can see for both of those equations there. So for Democrats, it's that value of 71.2, and for Republicans, it's that value of 43.5. Basically, what those numbers are telling us is that when we take the last 10 years as a whole, on average, every 2 years or every election cycle, Democrats' votes have increased by about 71,200 votes every 2 years. versus the Republicans' gain of 43,500 votes every 2 years. The major takeaway from that difference is that Democrats are still breaking away from Republicans at just under 30,000 votes every election cycle, and that's due largely in part to their very good turnout numbers in 2018, coupled with Republicans' return to normal numbers in that same year. It's a very good sign for Minnesota Democrats that midterm levels separated that much between the parties. It's also curious that there was a net gain of 0 for them at the House level. Of course, they flipped 2 seats, but so did Republicans. And what worked in Democrats' favor that year occurred in the suburbs. Let's next take a look at these other 2 line graphs. These are estimates for the rate of increase or decrease in those voter turnout ratios that I was using earlier in the video. First, looking at the Senatorial to House vote ratios, it's pretty steady, consistent advantage on Democrats' end. In how they elect senatorial candidates. That's apparent if you look at the last several senators they've had. I mean, it's just been a lot of Democrats. Largely why I think Tina Smith is going to win more definitively in the state this year than Joe Biden will. That's largely due to these historically how they've elected senators and where we think they're headed this year. It's a different story entirely for presidential candidates, though. We do see over the last 10 years Republicans having held on to that edge. We also see both parties' values decreasing, not by very much. Again, this is largely a reflection of the unpopularity of both Trump and Hillary Clinton in the state 4 years ago. And remember, because these values are relative to House turnout numbers, and we saw such great House turnout numbers from Democrats 2 years ago, difference like this, that's this close, it was just about 4% difference in 2016. That's not going to be enough to really help out Trump in the state this year, or for that matter, future Republicans running on the ticket. Okay, let's toss all those graphs aside. I'll give you my final consensus on Minnesota. When you look at the last decade, it was pretty clearly moving in Republicans' favor from about 2010 to 2016. But I believe in 2016, the state may have already hit an inflection point before it crossed the center line, and now is heading back into more Democratic territory, as evidenced by the move from 2016 to 2018. Donald Trump did get within 1.5% of carrying the state 4 years ago, but just 2 years later, we saw a major backlash from Democrats in the state. But bottom line, Minnesota was becoming more Republican from 2010 to 2016, but I think has already bounced back and is becoming more Democrat. Let's also take a moment to consider the fact that Minneapolis got more than its share of social unrest this year because of the death of George Floyd at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis. It still remains to be seen whether or not that will have an impact this year, but signs point to yes. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date, so if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.